There is a moment recorded in one of the oldest books ever written, a moment so strange, so overwhelming, so far beyond anything the human mind expects to encounter in the pages of ancient scripture, that scholars have debated it, mystics have built entire spiritual systems around it, and ordinary readers have stopped cold in their tracks and asked the same question across 3,000 years of human history. What in the world did this man actually see? The man's name was Ezekiel. He was a priest from Jerusalem. He was living in exile in Babylon, and one afternoon beside an ordinary irrigation canal, the sky above him cracked open, and he saw something that no human language was ever designed to describe. This is that story, and I want to tell it to you slowly, because this is not a story you can rush through. This is not a story you can summarize in a few bullet points and call it done. This is a story that demands that you sit with it, that you let it work on you, that you follow Ezekiel down to the edge of that canal and stand there beside him and feel the wind change before the vision comes. Because what Ezekiel saw was not merely a religious experience, though it was certainly that. What Ezekiel saw was not merely a theological vision, though it contained more theology than most people encounter in a lifetime of study. What Ezekiel saw was the answer to the most terrifying question his generation had ever faced, a question that had shattered the faith of thousands of his contemporaries, a question that still echoes down through every age in which human beings suffer and wonder whether God has simply left the building. That question was this: when everything falls apart, when the holy place is destroyed, when the people of God are scattered to the four winds, when all the structures and institutions and places and practices that once made the divine presence feel near and real and tangible are gone, when God seems to have vanished from the world entirely, is God actually gone? Has he abandoned his people? Has he left? Or is he still there, present in ways that human eyes have not yet learned to see? That was the question Ezekiel's generation was living inside, and the vision by the Chebar Canal was the answer. Let me take you back to the beginning. Let me place you in the world that Ezekiel inhabited so that when the vision comes, you understand exactly how impossible and how necessary it was. It is approximately 593 years before the birth of Jesus. The world is dominated by the empire of Babylon, the superpower of the ancient Near East, the greatest military and cultural force the world had yet produced. Nebuchadnezzar sits on the Babylonian throne, and his armies have already swept through the ancient world, ever through dry grass. Jerusalem has not yet fallen. That devastation is still coming, but the first wave of deportation has already happened. Nebuchadnezzar, in the early years of his campaigns against Judah, has already taken a significant portion of Jerusalem's population, including the king Jehoiachin and a large section of Jerusalem's educated and skilled class, its priests, its craftsmen, its soldiers, its scholars, and has marched them roughly 900 miles east to Babylon. Ezekiel was among them. He was young when the deportation happened. He was a priest by birth and by training, a son of Buzi, raised in the shadow of the great temple in Jerusalem, trained in all the rituals and laws and practices of the covenant faith of Israel. He knew the smell of the incense. He knew the weight of the priestly garments. He knew the layout of the temple courts with the intimacy of a man who had spent his entire life in their shadow. He knew the sound of the Levitical choir rising in the morning sacrifice. He knew what it felt like to stand in the presence of the most holy things of his religion. And then it was all taken away. He found himself in Babylon, in a community of Hebrew exiles settled near an irrigation canal called the Chebar, in a settlement that the text identifies as Tel Aviv. This was not a comfortable middle-class exile. This was displacement. This was a tearing away of everything familiar. This was living as a foreigner in a foreign land, under foreign domination, surrounded by foreign gods and foreign temples and foreign ways of doing everything, including foreign ways of understanding the divine. And the questions the exile raised were not merely practical. They were theological. They were existential. They cut to the very heart of everything the Hebrew faith had claimed about God. The theology of that era, not just in Israel but across the ancient world, operated on a geographical understanding of divine presence. The gods were tied to their territories. The gods of Babylon lived in Babylon. The gods of Egypt lived in Egypt. And the God of Israel, the Lord, the covenant God, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, lived in Jerusalem. More specifically, he lived in the temple. Even more specifically, he lived between the golden cherubim in the most holy place, that inner room of perfect darkness, where the Ark of the Covenant rested and where the divine glory, the Shekinah, was understood to dwell. This was a theology. This was a framework, and the exile had just destroyed it. Because if God lives in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem has been conquered by Babylon, then what does that mean? The ancient answer, the answer that every nation in that world would have given automatically, was obvious. It means the God of Jerusalem lost. It means the gods of Babylon won. It means the God of Israel is either weaker than Nebuchadnezzar's gods, or he has abandoned his people and his land entirely, and either way, the Hebrew faith is finished. That was what the exile felt like from the inside. That was the spiritual catastrophe that accompanied the political and military catastrophe. And it was real, it was devastating, and it was happening to Ezekiel and everyone around him. He had been in exile for 5 years when it happened, 5 years of this grinding theological crisis, 5 years of watching his community try to hold together their faith in a world that seemed to have definitively disproved it, 5 years of questions without answers, of prayers that seemed to bounce off the Babylonian sky and come back unanswered, of looking at the great ziggurats of Marduk and Ishtar rising against the horizon and wondering, consciously or unconsciously, whether those gods had simply one dot and then one day in the 30th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month. Ezekiel was sitting beside the Chebar Canal, and the sky to the north turned dark in a way that was not weather. Let me read you the opening of what Ezekiel recorded, because no paraphrase does justice to the original. He wrote, in the first person, as close as a human writer has ever come to describing the indescribable, as I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud, with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, as it were gleaming metal. That is how it begins. Wine from the north, a great cloud, brightness around it, continuous fire flashing from within it, and at the very heart of the cloud, gleaming metal, or in some translations, gleaming ember, a substance that catches and holds and radiates light in a way that no earthly material quite manages. But that is only the beginning. From within the fire, from within that blazing ember core, for living creatures emerged. Now I need you to slow down here, because these living creatures are the point at which most readers either lean forward with their entire attention or take a step back and try to process what they are being asked to imagine. There is no easy way to describe them. There is no familiar category that contains them. They are not the pleasant winged angels of popular imagination. They are not the sweet cherubs of Renaissance paintings. They are something else entirely, something that sits at the very edge of what the human mind can hold. Each of the 4 living creatures had the general form of a man. That is the starting point, humanoid in overall shape, but then the details begin to accumulate, and the human frame becomes a starting point rather than a conclusion. Each creature had 4 faces, not one face looking forward, as a human being has, but 4 faces ranged so that the creature could simultaneously look in 4 different directions without turning. The 4 faces were the face of a man, the face of a lion, the face of an ox, and the face of an eagle. The man face looking forward, the lion face looking to the right, the ox face looking to the left, the eagle face looking behind. Take a moment with that, not because it is designed to be aesthetically pleasing, but because it is designed to be symbolically complete. These 4 faces were not random. In the ancient world, these 4 creatures represented the pinnacle of their respective categories of created beings. The man was the highest of rational beings. The lion was the mightiest of wild animals. The ox was the most powerful of domesticated animals, the animal of labor and service and sustenance. The eagle was the supreme creature of the sky, the bird that flies higher than all others and sees farther than all others. 4 faces, 4 directions, 4 categories of creation's greatest creatures, all united in a single form that served the divine throne. Each creature had 4 wings. 2 of the upper wings stretched outward and touched the wings of the creatures beside them, so that the 4 beings together, when standing in their formation, created a kind of living canopy above the space between them. 2 lower wings folded downward to cover the body of the creature. Beneath the wings, where you would expect to see the arms of the man form, there were human hands, delicate, perfectly formed human hands, a striking and deliberate detail in the midst of all this overwhelming otherness. The legs were straight and strong, terminating not in human feet but in something like the hooves of a calf, and those hooves gleamed like polished bronze. The overall surface of the creatures gleamed like bronze, like burnished metal, catching and throwing back the fire that surrounded them and the fire that churned between them, between the 4 creatures. Where they stood in their formation, the ground was not empty ground. The ground was filled with burning coals and torches, living fire moving back and forth in the space between the beings. And from this fire, at unpredictable intervals, brilliant lightning flashed outward. The creatures moved together as a unit. When they moved forward, all 4 moved simultaneously. When they turned, they did not turn in the way that a creature turns by rotating its body, because with 4 faces there is no need to turn. They moved in any direction, instantly, like a flash of lightning, and each movement was coordinated with perfect precision, as if the 4 were not 4 separate beings but a single organism with 4 expressions. Now alongside each of the 4 living creatures, beside them on the ground, there were wheels, not metaphorical wheels, not symbolic wheels in the abstract, actual wheels, enormous, gleaming, made of a material described as chrysolite, which is a word that means something like yellow-green topaz, translucent and brilliant. Each wool was immense in scale, taller than the creatures themselves have placed upright. But here is where the geometry becomes truly strange. Each wool was actually two wheels intersecting at right angles. One wool set within another at a perpendicular angle, so that the resulting structure could move in any direction, forward, backward, sideways, diagonally, without the wheel needing to turn or pivot. The geometry was the movement itself. And the rims of the wheels were covered with eyes, not decorative eyes, not artistic representations of eyes, living eyes, embedded all along the outer rim of each wheel, all watching, all aware, all oriented simultaneously in every direction. The rims were described as high and awesome, and they were full of eyes all around. When the living creatures moved, the wheels moved with them. When the creatures rose into the air, the wheels rose too. When the creatures stood still, the wheels stood still. The wheels did not follow the creatures by mechanical connection. They followed because the same spirit that animated the creatures also animated the wheels. They were not separate objects in relationship. They were unified expressions of a single divine intelligence. Above the heads of the four living creatures, above the canopy formed by their outspread wings, there stretched an expanse. Ezekiel uses the word firmament, the same word used in Genesis for the solid dome of the sky, but this was not the ordinary sky. This expanse was described as like an awesome crystal, spread out above their heads, gleaming and transparent, like a vast sheet of perfectly clear ice or hammered glass or frozen sky, extending in all directions above the four beings and everything beneath them, and above the crystal expanse. Above that glassy heaven, there was a throne. The throne was made of what appeared to be sapphire, deep, perfect, royal blue sapphire, glowing with its own inner light, and it was set high, higher than the crystal expanse, higher than the living creatures, higher than the wheels. The throne on its platform of living sapphire stone was the apex of the whole structure, the still point around which everything else turned and moved and served. And on the throne, there was a form, a figure, something that appeared like a man, something that had the shape and the general proportion of a human being. But what Ezekiel saw when he looked at this figure seated above the sapphire throne was not human. From the waist up, the figure appeared like gleaming metal, like glowing amber, suffused with fire, not surrounded by fire, not lit by fire from outside, but made of fire, interchangeable with fire, the fire and the figure inseparable from each other. From the waist down, the figure appeared as fire, pure burning fire, brilliant and consuming, and around the entire figure, surrounding the throne, surrounding the fire, encompassing the whole vision from the ground to the topmost point of the sapphire platform, there was a rainbow, not a partial rainbow, not the arc of a rainbow seen in the sky after rain, but a full circle of radiant color, encompassing the entirety of the vision in a perfect ring of light, every color of the spectrum present and blazing, turning around the divine figure like a halo that has been expanded to cosmic scale. When Ezekiel saw this, and I want you to understand that this was not a gradual unveiling he observed from a comfortable distance. This was an eruption, a sudden arrival, an overwhelming sensory totality that hit him all at once. When Ezekiel saw this, he did the only rational thing a human being can do in the presence of the uncontainable divine. He fell on his face. His body went down. His face went into the dust of the canal bank. He was completely prostrate, arms extended forward, face pressed into the earth, his whole body as flat and as low as a human body can get, in the position of absolute submission and absolute smallness before absolute greatness. And then a voice spoke. It came from above the throne. It was described elsewhere in the book as like the sound of many waters, like the sound of thunder, like the voice of the Almighty. But it was articulate. It had words. And the first word it gave to Ezekiel was a title. Son of man. That was what God called him. Son of man. In Hebrew, Ben Adam, child of the earth. The phrase that emphasizes the creaturehood of the creature, the humanity of the human, the mortality and finitude and groundedness of the one being addressed. You're a son of man. You are made of dust. You are small and temporary and finite. And I am speaking to you. The contrast between the address and the addressee is the whole point. The one who sits above the crystal firmament, above the living creatures, above the wheels, above the fire is not a being of the same order as the one lying with his face in the dirt by the irrigation canal. And yet the voice speaks downward. And what it says is, stand up. I have something to tell you. I have something for you to do. The Spirit entered Ezekiel and lifted him to his feet. Now I want to pause the narrative here for a moment and just sit with what we have been given so far, because before we go forward into what God told Ezekiel, and before we explore the significance of everything Ezekiel was about to be commissioned to do, I think we need to spend some time with the vision itself, because the vision is not merely the dramatic opening act of Ezekiel's prophetic story. The vision is the argument, The vision is the answer. The vision is the theological revolution that the exiles needed and did not know they needed, delivered in a form so vivid, so specific, so overwhelming, that it could not be argued with, could not be dismissed, could not be reduced to abstraction. Let me explain what I mean. The Babylonian Empire, at the time Ezekiel received this vision, was the most powerful expression of a particular understanding of the divine that the ancient world had produced. The Babylonians believed in many gods, and they believed that those gods were bound to specific places, specific territories, specific temples. The god Marduk was the god of Babylon, and his power and presence were centered in the great temple of Ezekiel in the heart of the city. The ziggurats, those massive stepped pyramids that dominated the skylines of Babylonian cities, were not merely religious monuments. They were understood to be the literal dwelling places of the gods. The stairways going up the sides of the ziggurats were the stairways the gods used to descend from heaven to their earthly homes. In this understanding of the divine, the gods were real, but they were local. They had addresses, they had territories, and when armies clashed, it was understood that the gods of the winning side were more powerful than the gods of the losing side. From this perspective, the fall of Jerusalem and the deportation of the Hebrew exiles was not just a political event, it was a theological verdict. The gods of Babylon had defeated the God of Israel. Marduk was stronger than the Lord, and the God of Israel, if he had any real power at all, was stuck back in Jerusalem, sitting in his wrecked temple, unable to help his scattered people who were now living under the shadow of superior divine power. This was the theological crisis of the exile, and it was not merely an intellectual crisis, it was an existential one, because if that reading of events was correct, then the entire foundation on which the Hebrew faith had been built was gone, the covenant was void, the promises were lies. The God of Israel was either defeated or absent or simply powerless, and the exiles in Tel Aviv were on their own in a foreign land with a dead religion. Now watch what the vision does to that entire framework. The vision does not appear in Jerusalem. It does not appear in the temple. It does not appear in any of the places that the theology of the day would designate as the appropriate location for a divine encounter. It appears beside an irrigation canal in Babylon, in the heart of enemy territory, in the land of the supposedly victorious gods. In the place where the God of Israel should, by all the logic of the ancient world, have no presence and no power. And what appears there is not a diminished God, not a defeated God, not a God whose presence has leaked out of a destroyed temple and found its way feebly to Babylon. What appears there is the fullness of divine glory, the complete, overwhelming, incomprehensible reality of the one who sits enthroned above the cherubim, above the crystal firmament, above the wheels and the fire and the living creatures, radiant with fire and encompassed by a rainbow. And the first thing the vision communicates, before a single word is spoken, is this: God is not stuck in a building. God is not local. God is not bound to a territory or a temple or a people or a place. God moves. God moves on for living creatures with fur faces and for wings. God moves on wheels of living fire with eyes that see in all directions simultaneously. God moves across the crystal firmament of heaven and descends to any point on the surface of the earth that he chooses. And right now, tonight, by this irrigation canal in the heart of Babylon, he has chosen to descend here. The wheels are the theological revolution. The wheels are the answer to the exile, because a God who has wheels cannot be conquered. A God who has wheels cannot be left behind. A God whose throne is mobile, whose presence is not fixed to a specific address, who can appear anywhere, who can travel at the speed of lightning, who moves simultaneously in all directions because the wheels within wheels can rotate in any plane. That God is not a local deity. That God is not the property of a specific temple or a specific nation. That God is sovereign over the whole earth and everything in it, including Babylon, including the Chebar Canal, including this moment, including this man lying in the dust. That is the vision. That is what it means. That is why it matters. Now let us continue the story. Ezekiel is on his feet. The Spirit has lifted him. The voice from the throne is speaking. And what it says is the beginning of the hardest and most important assignment of his life. God tells Ezekiel that he is being sent to the people of Israel, the people already in exile, but also the people still in Jerusalem who do not yet know what is coming. He is being sent to speak to them, to warn them, to be a voice that tells the truth about what is happening and why and what comes next. But God does not describe this mission with easy optimism. He does not send Ezekiel with the assurance that people will listen and respond and everything will go well. What he says is almost shockingly honest. He says that Israel is a rebellious house, a nation that has transgressed against God, a people with hard foreheads and stubborn hearts. He says they may not listen. In fact, he implies they will not listen, but that does not change the assignment. Ezekiel is to speak the words whether they are received or rejected, because the purpose of the prophetic word is not only to produce immediate change. The purpose of the prophetic word is to be spoken, to be on record, to give the people the opportunity they need even when they are likely to reject it, and to stand as testimony when the judgment comes and they cannot say they were not warned. This is a hard thing to be told at the beginning of a calling. Go and speak. And by the way, they probably will not listen, but go anyway, and God does something before he sends Ezekiel. He gives him something to eat. A hand appears, extending from the vision, a hand holding a scroll. The scroll unrolls in the air before Ezekiel, and it is written on both sides, front and back, every surface covered with writing. And what is written on the scroll is described as words of lament and mourning and woe. This is not a scroll of comfort and celebration. This is a scroll of grief, of warning, of the hard truth about what is coming, and God tells Ezekiel to eat it. I want you to feel the strangeness of that instruction before we move past it, because it is strange. It is deliberately, purposefully strange. Eat the scroll. Take the divine word not merely into your mind, not merely into your understanding, not merely into your convictions, but into your body. Let it become part of you in the most physical, most visceral, most intimate way possible. Let the word of God be inside you in the way that food is inside you. Let it nourish you and become you and speak through you, not as an external message you are delivering, but as a living reality you are embodying. And Ezekiel opens his mouth and eats the scroll, and here is the moment that catches everyone who reads it. The scroll is full of lament and mourning and woe. It is a scroll of grief and warning. By every earthly expectation, it should taste bitter. It should be hard to swallow. It should be a grim and difficult experience. But when Ezekiel eats the scroll, he says it tasted as sweet as honey. This is one of the most profound details in the entire account, because what it tells us is something about the nature of the prophetic call and something about the nature of the divine word that applies far beyond Ezekiel's specific situation. The word of God, even when it is a word of judgment, even when it is a word of lament and mourning, even when it is a word that nobody wants to hear, is still the word of life. It is still truth, and truth, even hard truth, has a sweetness that lies cannot replicate, because truth is the only thing that can actually help you. Truth is the only thing that has any contact with reality, and reality is the only ground on which anything can be built. Ezekiel eats the scroll. The word of God becomes his word. He is ready to speak, but before he is sent, God gives him a title and a job description that he will carry for the rest of his life. He is called a watchman for the house of Israel. In the ancient world, the watchman was the person stationed at the top of the city walls or on a high tower, whose job was to see what was coming from a distance and to warn the city in time for the city to respond. When an enemy army was spotted on the horizon, the watchman sounded the alarm, and the responsibility of the watchman was absolute. If the watchman saw the danger and failed to sound the alarm, and the city was destroyed, the blood of the people was on the watchman's hands. But if the watchman sounded the alarm and the people chose not to respond, not to prepare, not to take the threat seriously, then the blood was on their own hands. The watchman had fulfilled his responsibility. He had warned them. What they did with the warning was their own choice. This is Ezekiel's calling. He is not a motivational speaker. He is not a comfort minister whose job is to make people feel better about themselves. He is a watchman. His job is to see what is coming, because God has shown him, and to warn people clearly and unambiguously, because they need to know, and to do this whether or not they want to hear it, because the truth of what is coming does not change based on people's willingness to receive it. And so Ezekiel is sent back to his people. The wind carries him. He is transported, in something he describes as a trance or a vision state, back to the exile settlement at Tel Aviv, and he sits among the exiles for 7 days. 7 days of silence. 7 days in which the weight of what he has been given and what he has been asked to do settles into him. 7 days of bitter anguish, as he describes it, before he is ready to begin. 7 days. Not 7 minutes of prayer and then a quick start. Not a brief transition period before getting to work. 7 days of sitting with the full weight of the calling. 7 days of processing what he has seen and what he has been asked to say and what the cost of saying it will be. And then God speaks to him again, and the watchman's ministry begins. Now I want to take us deeper into the vision itself, because the living creatures and the wheels and the throne, while extraordinary in themselves, are not merely exotic decorations. Every element of the vision carries meaning that Ezekiel and his original audience would have understood, and that changes the way we hear everything that follows. The 4 living creatures are identified later in the book of Ezekiel, in the 10th chapter, as cherubim. This identification is critical. Cherubim were not the small chubby babies of popular medieval art. Cherubim, in the Hebrew understanding, were the highest rank of divine beings. the beings whose specific function was to attend upon and serve the divine throne. They were not angels who carried messages or protected individuals. They were throne bearers. They were the living support of the divine presence. When the temple was built in Jerusalem, the innermost room, the Holy of Holies, contained two massive golden cherubim, each 15 feet tall, their wings stretched out and touching in the center of the room above the Ark of the Covenant. These golden statues were not just decorative. They were understood to be the earthly representation of the actual heavenly beings who bore the divine throne in reality. The space above the Ark, in the darkness between the outstretched wings of the golden cherubim, was the earthly meeting point of the divine presence. That was where the glory of God rested. That was the most holy place. So when Ezekiel sees four living creatures beside the Chebar Canal, and when those creatures are later identified as cherubim, what he is seeing is the throne room of God, not a representation of it, not a symbol of it. The actual thing, the reality that the Jerusalem temple was designed to represent, has appeared in its full and overwhelming and living reality beside an irrigation canal in Babylon. The implications are enormous. If the cherubim are here, the throne is here. If the throne is here, God is here, not a diminished God, not a God in exile. The full, complete, undivided divine presence, attended by the highest order of heavenly beings, present at a specific geographical location in the heart of Babylonian territory, and that location is the one where the exiles live. Think about what that means for the exiles. Think about what that means for Ezekiel. The thing they feared most, the thing that exiles seemed to have confirmed, the absence of God, was a lie. God had not been defeated. God had not been left behind in a ruined temple. God had not been absorbed into the Babylonian pantheon. God had moved. God had followed his people, not because he was obligated to, not because they had earned his presence, but because he chose to, because he willed to, because the mobility of the divine throne is not a theological technicality but an expression of the divine character, a God who will not let his people go even into the depths of their own judgment. The wheels tell you something specific about how God moves, the wheels within wheels that can move in any direction without turning, attended by living eyes that see simultaneously in every direction. These are not merely impressive divine machinery, they are a statement about divine omnipresence. A God who needs to turn before moving is a God constrained by geometry. A God whose wheels move in any direction simultaneously is a God to whom geography is irrelevant. You cannot outrun these wheels. You cannot go somewhere these wheels cannot follow. There is no direction you can move, no depth you can descend to, no height you can ascend to, in which these wheels are not already capable of arriving. This is the God of Psalm 139. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. Ezekiel saw the wheels beside the Chebar Canal in Babylon, and the wheels were the visual answer to that psalm. You cannot flee from this presence, not into Babylon, not into exile, not into the darkest theology of despair. The wheels follow. The wheels are always already there. And the eyes on the rims of the wheels are the statement about divine awareness, the eyes that see in all directions simultaneously, that see without turning, that miss nothing. Those eyes are the visual form of the answer to another ancient question. The question that exile inevitably raises. Does God see? Does God know what is happening to us here? Is any of this registered? Are we just forgotten people in a forgotten corner of the world? Beneath the notice of heaven, the eyes on the wheels say, no, nothing is forgotten. Nothing is unobserved. Every moment of exile suffering, every night of weeping, every prayer offered toward Jerusalem from beside a Babylonian canal, every child born in captivity who has never seen the promised land, every old man and woman who died in exile without returning home, all of it is seen, all of it is known. The eyes on the wheels miss nothing. This is not a small comfort. In the context of what the exiles were experiencing, in the context of what humans in every age of suffering have experienced, the assurance that God sees, that God knows, that the divine awareness is not limited by geography or circumstance, is one of the most necessary things a human being can hear. Let me talk now about the crystal firmament, because it is one of the elements of the vision that is often overlooked in favor of the more dramatic living creatures and wheels, but which carries its own profound freight of meaning. The firmament that Ezekiel describes is transparent. He says it was like the gleam of awesome crystal, like ice, like perfectly clear glass, and it is stretched out above the living creatures like a sky. It is a threshold, a boundary, a line of demarcation between the created order below, including even the exalted living creatures who bear the divine throne, and the uncreated divine reality above. The firmament says something that the rest of the vision might seem to contradict. It says that there is a difference. There is an infinite qualitative difference between the creator and the creation, between the divine and everything that is not divine, between the one who sits on the throne and everything that serves the throne. No matter how magnificent and powerful and awesome that created order might be, the living creatures are extraordinary beyond description, but they are below the firmament. The firmament is the visual statement that even the highest reaches of creation are still creation, still creaturely, still on the other side of the crystal line from the one who made it. This matters because one of the temptations in the midst of overwhelming religious experience is to collapse the distinction between the creature and the creator, to mistake the vehicle for the destination, to worship the vision rather than the one the vision points toward. The firmament prevents that. It holds the line. No matter how far up you go in the created order, no matter how high and awesome and blazing with reflected divine fire the cherubim and the wheels and the crystal expanse may be, there is still a fundamental threshold, a crystal line, a firmament of grace and distance, and above that threshold is the one who cannot be contained in any created category. And above the firmament, the sapphire throne. The throne is the statement about sovereignty. In every culture and language and era of human history, a throne is not merely a piece of furniture. A throne is a claim. A throne says, this is where power resides. This is where decisions are made. This is the point from which all other authority derives. And the sapphire throne of Ezekiel's vision, set high above the crystal firmament, above the blazing living creatures, above the fire-filled wheels, is the statement that sovereignty over everything, over Babylon and Judah and the exile and the temple and the nations, belongs to the one seated there. Not to Nebuchadnezzar, not to Marduk, not to any of the earthly or spiritual powers that are currently ranging human history in ways that seem to have no regard for justice or covenant. The one on the sapphire throne is in charge, not in charge in the way that a distant administrator is nominally in charge of a situation that is actually controlled by local powers, in charge in the way that the one who made everything is in charge of everything he made, and the rainbow around the throne is not an afterthought. The rainbow is the covenant. From the very first time a rainbow appears in the biblical narrative, in the aftermath of the flood, the rainbow is the sign of God's commitment, his promise, his self-binding to a relationship with the created order. The rainbow that encompasses the entire divine vision in Ezekiel's account is the statement that everything the vision contains, all the fire and the glory and the overwhelming transcendence, is framed by covenant, is framed by promise, is framed by the relationship that God has bound himself to and will not abandon. The exiles in Babylon looked at the ruins of their world and wondered if the covenant was over, if God's commitments had proven conditional after all, if the promises given to Abraham and Moses and David had an expiration date that had now been reached. And the rainbow around the throne says, no, the covenant is not over. The covenant is not conditional on your performance. The covenant is the frame within which everything else happens, including the judgment, including the exile, including this overwhelming vision by an irrigation canal in the middle of an empire that thinks it has one. Now let us follow the story further, because Ezekiel's ministry, shaped and energized by this foundational vision, is about to do some things that are unlike almost anything else in the biblical narrative. The first major task God gives Ezekiel is not to stand up and preach his sermon. It is to perform a series of what scholars call sign acts, symbolic actions, enacted parables, things that Ezekiel does with his body and with objects in the physical world that communicate divine messages through symbol and drama rather than through words alone. God tells Ezekiel to take a clay brick and engrave on it a map of Jerusalem, then to set up siege works around it, a model of the military siege that is coming, ramps, enemy camps, battering rams, the whole apparatus of ancient warfare in miniature, surrounding the clay representation of the city that Ezekiel loves, and then to take an iron griddle and hold it up between himself and the city model, like a wall, a barrier, a sign that God has placed something between himself and the city, some barrier of judgment that the prayers of the people cannot pass through in that season. And then God tells Ezekiel to lie on his side beside this model siege, first on his left side for 390 days, bearing the iniquity of Israel, then on his right side for 40 days, bearing the iniquity of Judah, with measured amounts of food and rationed water. I want you to understand what this cost Ezekiel. This was not a dramatic gesture made once in front of a crowd. This was more than a year of his life spent lying on his side beside a model siege, in public, in the exile settlement, visible to everyone, eating exactly the measured rations that God specified, bearing in his body the weight of what the people of God had accumulated over centuries of rebellion. This is how seriously God took the assignment of making the prophetic word incarnate. Not just words, not just speeches, not just scrolls. The prophet himself, his body, his time, his physical existence, enlisted as the medium through which the divine message was conveyed. God also told Ezekiel to cut his hair and his beard and then divide the hair into 3 equal portions. 1/3 he was to burn, 1/3 he was to strike with a sword, 1/3 he was to scatter to the wind, because this was what was coming for the people of Jerusalem. 1/3 would die of famine and plague within the besieged city. 1/3 would fall by the sword when the city walls were breached. 1/3 would be scattered to every wind, exiled and dispersed to the ends of the earth. The exile community watched Ezekiel perform these sign acts, and some of them understood, and some of them chose not to understand, and all of them were confronted with something that could not be as easily dismissed as a speech. When a prophet lies down on the ground for over a year in front of you, you cannot simply decide not to listen. The sign act is there. It is visible. It is a fact before it is a message, and throughout all of this, the vision of the throne room remained with Ezekiel, not as a fading memory but as a living reality that informed every word he spoke and every act he performed. The one who had appeared beside the canal was the one who was commissioning every sign act, authorizing every speech, sustaining every day of the year long lying on the side by the model siege. The wheels were still turning, the eyes were still watching, the throne was still occupied. Now I want to move to one of the most extraordinary passages in the entire book, a passage that builds directly on the opening vision of the throne, chariot, and develops its central argument about divine presence and divine mobility to its most devastating and most hopeful conclusion. In chapters 8 through 11 of the book, Ezekiel is given a series of visions that take him, in the spirit, to Jerusalem itself. He is transported, supernaturally, from his house in Tel Aviv in Babylon to the Jerusalem temple. And what he is shown, there is both a diagnosis of why judgment is coming and an account of what that judgment will look like. The vision begins with the familiar blazing appearance that Ezekiel has come to recognize, the same overwhelming divine fire, the same figure of brightness and glory, and this figure reaches out and grabs Ezekiel by a lock of his hair in the vision, and lifts him up, and carries him through the air across the 900 miles between Babylon and Jerusalem, and sets him down at the north gate of the temple. What Ezekiel then sees in the temple is a systematic survey of apostasy, of the ways in which the very people who should have been the guardians of true worship had turned the holy place into the center of every form of false worship. He is shown an idol at the north gate, what the text calls the image of jealousy, a foreign deity set up in the very entrance to the temple courts. He is shown a hidden chamber in the temple precincts where 70 of the elders of Israel, the religious leadership, are burning incense to images carved on the walls, gods, crawling things, and beasts. In total secret, he sees women weeping for Tammuz at the temple gate, a Babylonian fertility deity, the seasonal mourning rite of a foreign religion being performed on the threshold of the house of the Lord. He sees men inside the inner court, in the space closest to the holy place, standing with their backs to the temple and their faces toward the east, worshipping the sun. Each layer of the vision is worse than the previous one. Each layer takes the desecration of the holy place further, moves it closer to the center, makes it more brazen and more complete. And Ezekiel watches all of it with the mixed horror of a priest who knows exactly what these spaces are supposed to be used for, and a prophet who understands exactly what these abominations mean for what is coming, because the theology is relentless. The divine presence that dwells in the Holy of Holies, between the golden cherubim, above the Ark of the Covenant, does not coexist neutrally with other gods, does not accommodate itself to a multi-faith approach to the temple courts. The God of Israel, the covenant God, the one Ezekiel has seen on the sapphire throne above the crystal firmament above the blazing living creatures, is not one option among several. He is the creator. He is the sovereign. He is the one before whom there is no other. And when the people assigned to be his representatives, the priests and elders and temple servants of Jerusalem, fill his house with the worship of every deity except him, something has to give, and now Ezekiel sees what gives. He watches the divine glory, the blazing presence that he first saw at the Chebar Canal, begin to move. It begins to withdraw, slowly, in stages, as if even in the act of departure there is a kind of reluctance, a prolonged opportunity for repentance, a visible demonstration of the movement so that no one who sees it can claim ignorance. The glory rises from between the cherubim. It had been resting there, above the ark, in the darkness of the Holy of Holies, since the temple was built, since the day Solomon dedicated the temple, and the cloud of glory filled it so completely that the priests could not stand to minister. The glory has been there all that time, through all the generations of Israel's history in that land, through all the cycles of faithfulness and rebellion that the books of Kings record. It has stayed, through it all. It has stayed, but now, at the command of the one whose throne Ezekiel has seen, it rises. It rises from between the golden cherubim and moves to the threshold of the temple. It pauses there, at the doorway, still within the sacred structure but no longer in the most holy place, as if standing at the door and looking back before leaving. Then it moves to the east gate of the inner court, the large gate that faces the Mount of Olives. It pauses again, still on the Temple Mount, still within the complex, still, perhaps, accessible to those who would turn and look. Then it moves to the great east gate of the outer court, the gate that leads out of the temple complex entirely. Another pause, another moment of lingering, another opportunity. And then it lifts up from the east gate of the temple, and it hovers over the city,